Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the National Churchill Museum at Westminster College. I am Dr. Jim Williams, the Executive Director and the Trout Professor of Churchill Studies here at the National Churchill Museum. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the museum on Winston Churchill Day in the United States. Though every day feels like Winston Churchill Day at Westminster College, today across the country we are celebrating Winston Churchill Day, because on April 9th, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the legislation that made Winston Churchill, who was already half American by birth, an honorary citizen of the United States of America. And that is why today is Winston Churchill Day in the U.S. I'm especially glad to welcome members of the Association of Churchill Fellows, who are having their annual meeting this weekend at the museum, and to welcome those among you for whom this is a first visit to the National Churchill Museum, and our magnificent Wren Church of St. Mary the Virgin Aldermanbury, brought from London stone by stone and reconstructed by Westminster College 50 years ago this year. I hope to see all of you back here in the church tomorrow afternoon at 2 for our annual Kemper Lecture on Winston Churchill and British History. You will not want to miss Professor Klaus Lauris's talk entitled War, Terror, and Global Order, The Search for Stability from the Iron Curtain to the President. Professor Lauris has come all the way from Berlin, sitting over there, to be with us this weekend, so welcome, Dr. Lauris. And finally, I must welcome Garry Kasparov and Mig Greengard to the National Churchill Museum and Westminster. A self-professed admirer of Harry Truman and Winston Churchill, Mr. Kasparov kindly accepted our invitation to speak at Westminster College during this 70th anniversary year of the Iron Curtain speech, and we are so pleased that he is here. We are honored that you are here. I hope this will not be your last visit to the museum. In Mr. Kasparov's book, How Life Imitates Chess, he asserts the only way to develop is to venture into the unknown, to take risks, and to learn new things. We must force ourselves out of our comfort zone and trust our ability to adapt and to thrive. That is what I learned to do as a student here at Westminster College, one of the best liberal arts colleges in the country, I might add, 30 years ago, and when I was a student, and that is what Amelia Ayers has learned to do more recently at the college. Ms. Ayers is a senior from St. Louis and is an active member of Omicron Sigma Sigma, the Honor Society for Homeland Security, Intelligence, Emergency Management, and all protective security disciplines. The OSS chapter at Westminster is a sponsor of today's lecture. Security Studies is a recent addition to the college curriculum and has become one of our signature programs. Ms. Ayers, in so many ways, is a shining example of the graduates that Westminster College produces, and it's my genuine pleasure to invite her to introduce our lecturer.
On behalf of the Westminster College chapter of Omicron Sigma Sigma, our National Security Studies Honor Society, it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Mr. Garry Kasparov. At 22 years of age, he became the youngest world chess champion in history in 1985. Mr. Kasparov remained the top-ranked chess player for the next 20 years until his retirement in 2005. During his incredible chess career, he became one of the first prominent Soviet citizens to call for democratic and market reforms. His courage manifested most notably in his support of Boris Yeltsin's efforts to reshape the Soviet Union. He later joined the Russian pro-democracy movement, founded the United Civil Front, and organized marches of dissent to protest the repressive policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin. In 2012, Mr. Kasparov was named the chairman of the New York City-based Human Rights Foundation. Facing imminent arrest during Putin's most recent crackdown, Mr. Kasparov moved from Moscow to New York City in 2013. Since then, he has lectured around the world and recently published a book, Winter is Coming, Why Vladimir Putin and Enemies of the Free World Must Be Stopped. I might add copies of which are available in the National Churchill Museum for purchase after these remarks. Most notably, Mr. Kasparov has demonstrated in his writing and speaking that he is an admirer of Sir Winston Churchill. So we are honored on Winston Churchill Day in the United States to welcome Mr. Garry Kasparov to share his views on significant world issues and the courage to continue. Ladies and gentlemen, our honored guest, Mr. Garry Kasparov.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Westminster College, Churchill Museum, and all of you for coming today. The title of my speech here today is The Courage to Continue. I hope the many experts here with us will forgive my slight jest in using one of the countless quotations incorrectly attributed to Churchill for my title. It goes, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." Very nice, but there is no record of Churchill ever saying or writing this. But this quote is found everywhere with his name attached. As the great Leo Tolstoy once said, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." Actually, it should be quite flattering. If there is a great phrase about courage, it instantly becomes more credible when Winston Churchill's name is put on it. After all, Churchill did write that courage is the first of human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees all others. It is also the quality that always attracted him to me the most. 53 years ago, on April 9, 1963, 4 days before I was born, President John F. Kennedy announced honorary American citizenship for Winston Churchill. JFK said, "Whenever and wherever tyranny is threatened, he has always championed liberty. Facing firmly toward the future, he has never forgotten the past. Serving 6 monarchs of his native Great Britain, he has served all men's freedom and dignity." Kennedy's statement sums up why Churchill will always be known as a touchstone for moral courage, and not only for his wartime leadership. He was right on the biggest things by staying true to his beliefs, even if he was not always heeded in time. And so, it is a great privilege to be speaking to you here today to honor a man and an occasion that means so much to me and to all of you. When Churchill gave his famous speech here in Fulton 70 years ago, the New York Times reported that it was such a momentous occasion that people had come from as far away as distant St. Louis. I arrived from New York City this morning, but as you can tell from my accent, I have come a much greater distance in my life to be here with you today. Actually, I like to tell American audiences that I was born in a deep south right next to Georgia. And that's true. I was born in the deep south of the Soviet Union in Baku, Azerbaijan, right next to the Republic of Georgia. My parents were still in school in the Soviet Union at the time of Sir Winston's speech here in 1946. They grew up as the Iron Curtain he warned about grew higher and thicker between the free and unfree worlds. By the time I won my first Soviet chess title in 1976, at age 12, many of the things Churchill had warned about had been the status quo for a generation. The divided Germany, the Soviet bloc, and the Cold War were, it seemed, permanent parts of our lives. But by the time I became world champion in 1985, it was increasingly clear that the seeds of Cold War victory that had been planted by Churchill and President Harry Truman right here in Fulton were beginning to bear fruit. It took one more leader possessing bold certainty and vision, Ronald Reagan, to finish the job and to free the hundreds of millions of people that Churchill and Truman had been unable to save from communist oppression. My family and I in Azerbaijan were among them. And so do not thank me for coming here today. I thank you for my freedom to be here. At least those of you who voted for Reagan. And yet, in the year 2000, just 9 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, just 9 short years after celebrating crowds in Moscow tore down the statue of KGB founder Felix Dzerzhinsky, Russia had a KGB lieutenant colonel for its president, Vladimir Putin. My dream of raising my children in a free and democratic Russia began to fade. And there was no Reagan, no Truman, no Churchill to help us. We must all find the courage to continue their fight for freedom. Churchill's speech here in 1946 was not well received in Russia, as you might imagine. I can only hope that in that one respect, my speech today matches his. In a pattern that is now very familiar, the Soviets tried to frame Churchill and his warning speech as the message of a warmonger betraying the peace-loving Soviet Union. I remember my die-hard communist grandfather getting quite agitated when telling me about this supposed betrayal that became a turning point in world history. If he could only see me today here. The Iron Curtain part of the speech received the entire focus, and Churchill was attacked as a genetic anti-communist, unable to overcome his prejudice against communism despite his alliance with Stalin against Hitler during the war. And this, at least, was accurate. Churchill had condemned the Bolsheviks early and often, although in 1919 he was, and in the 30s, dismissed as a crank. Still, we cannot downplay the courage it took for him to stand up to Stalin, a man he had praised during the war years and legitimately respected at the time. World War II had finally ended with VJ Day just 6 months before the Fulton speech. But Churchill understood there was no time to celebrate, that it was not a moment to relax. Thankfully, this time, unlike in 1919 and unlike in 1938, people listened to him. Or to be more precise, Harry S. Truman listened. Even more importantly, the man from Missouri acted. It was a remarkable partnership, the eloquent blue blood and the plain-spoken president from independence, without a worldly or aristocratic bone in his body. They had seen the power of evil all too close during the war, something that cannot be said for most of our leaders today. As such, since the end of the Cold War, it has become unfashionable, politically incorrect, to talk about universal moral ideals like individual freedom and the value of human life. In 1946, it was far from obvious what direction America would turn. The world's lone superpower could have turned its back on the world again, as it had after the First World War. Truman could have let Europe collapse, allowed Stalin to swallow even more territory, from Greece to Iran, and let the communists take over Taiwan and South Korea. Instead, ignoring domestic political risks, he defended and rebuilt Western Europe and Japan, sent billions of American dollars to support recently vanquished enemies. More quietly, and just as impressively, Truman built the policies and institutions that would protect and guide the free world for decades. The post-war United Nations, NATO, the CIA, the NSA, the Voice of America, practically the entire infrastructure of the Cold War. Truman had been vice president for only 82 days when Franklin Roosevelt died, but somehow he was the right man at the right time. Under intense pressure, this stubborn little man became a diamond. Truman was diligent, not flamboyant. He was not interested in his place in history or in making grand bargains for the headlines. It is no exaggeration to say that he saved the world and then moved back to Independence, Missouri, to quietly live out his life. And what could be more American than that? The Cold War ended once and for all in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a great moment, deservedly celebrated around the world. It was the end of a long and dark era, if not unfortunately the end of history. 1992 was like 1946, a turning point. Unfortunately, the response by the victorious side was very different. Instead of pressing the advantage and resisting complacency, the free world let down its guard and let bygones be bygones. The sense of purpose provided by having an existential enemy in the USSR was lost, and nothing replaced it. Diplomacy and engagement were a great success in Eastern Europe, but the purely positive pressure offered by the European Union and the United States had no impact on the many former Soviet republics, where the communist dictatorship quickly morphed into local dictatorships that are still in place today, 25 years later. The institutions that had been conceived and built by Churchill and Truman in the 40s were not updated or replaced when the Cold War ended. The United Nations was designed to freeze conflict between two nuclear superpowers. Its stagnancy was in many ways a virtue. But Churchill warned here in 1946 that the world government should be a force for good and for action, and not, as he put it, merely a frothing of words and a cockpit in the Tower of Babel. As with so many of the great man's warnings, this has come to pass. The UN's rules put some of the world's most oppressive regimes on its Human Rights Council, provide a lecture platform for brutal dictators, and granted no ability to defend the principles of its founders. The Cold War was won not just by military or economic superiority, but on values. I, a former Soviet citizen, unironically call traditional American values, or more broadly, Western values. Churchill called on an alliance of the English-speaking peoples. All these terms are obsolete today, and it's the duty of every democracy, not just the United States and the United Kingdom or Western Europe, but of every free and open society from Brazil to Japan, from South Africa to South Korea, to defend these values. Globalization is a blessing in many ways, but we are allowing it to drag us down to the lowest common moral denominator instead of rising us all toward the highest. We need an alliance of, to update Churchill, the democracy-speaking peoples. We need new institutions to meet 21st century challenges. We need new frameworks to confront globalized dictatorships. Globalization has effectively compressed the world in size, increasing the mobility of goods, capital, and labor. Simultaneously, this has led to globalization across time, as the 21st century collides with cultures and regimes intent on existing as in centuries past. Radical Islamists set the time machine to the Dark Ages and encourage the murder of all who oppose them, often supported by fatwas and funds from terror sponsors like Iran. Vladimir Putin wants Russia to exist in the great power era of tsars and monarchs, dominating its neighbors by force and undisturbed by elections and rights complaints. As Churchill said about the Soviets 70 years ago, Putin does not desire war, but he desires the fruits of war. In the East, Kim Jong-un's North Korea attempts to freeze time in a Stalinist prison camp bubble. In the West, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and the Castros in Cuba use anachronistic socialist propaganda to resist increasing pressure for human rights. What unites these time travelers is their rejection of modernity, or what we should call modern values. With violence and with violent rhetoric, the time travelers' natural target is often the traditional champion of the rights that threaten them, the United States of America. The freedoms represented by the First Amendment frighten the radical mullahs and the dictators more than drone strikes or economic sanctions. And make no mistake, no matter how much it tries to retreat from the world. As it is doing now, the United States will be their number one target for as long as it remains preeminent. Globalist economies have global interests, and stability is essential for global trade. Unless the US is prepared to roll back the countless benefits its companies and citizens reap from cheap energy and international markets for American products and services, walking away as the chaos grows behind you is self-destructive in the extreme. We must end our complacency, not just on the political or foreign policy level, but at every level. Stagnant politics and stagnant economies leave us vulnerable to every type of destructive fantasy, from radical Islam to xenophobic fascism to the siren song of socialism. I'm sorry, Bernie Sanders fans, but I've been through it. Now let me tell you, the failures of capitalism are far better than the success of socialism. If the modern world fails to provide our young people with a sense of challenge and purpose, some of them will look for purpose by rebelling against that world or by attacking that world. It is no coincidence that the values of the American century are also the values of innovation and exploration. Individual freedom, risk-taking, investment, opportunity, ambition, and sacrifice. Religious and secular dictatorships cannot compete with these values, and so they attack the system founded upon them. We must defend our values aggressively, or steadily we will lose them, one savage terrorist attack at a time. One way to lose a war is to refuse to admit you are in one. And that is how the free world is losing today, through apathy, through denial, and through complacency. This is not only a metaphorical war of values, it is real, and there are casualties. 19 individuals killed more Americans on 9/11 than the entire Japanese fleet killed at Pearl Harbor. Thousands have been killed during Putin's invasion of Ukraine, including 300 shot out of the sky by Russian forces on Malaysia flight MH17. Attacks in Paris, San Bernardino, Brussels, and others further from our headlines in Indonesia, Turkey, Kenya, and Nigeria. This is a war, and by refusing to admit it, we're putting our civilians on the front line instead of our soldiers. Between the extremes of appeasement and war is a very large gray area called leadership. Let us remember that appeasement has killed far more people than deterrence. Perhaps it's because I grew up in a communist country that I cannot so casually ignore the suffering of the people being left behind today, from Cuba to Syria to Ukraine. Ronald Reagan was called a warmonger by the same crowd that is praising Obama to the skies today. And yet, Reagan is the one who freed hundreds of millions of people from the communist yoke, not the celebrated peacekeepers Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter. If Barack Obama had been president instead of Ronald Reagan, I'd be probably still playing chess for the Soviet Union. Despite the painful lessons of history, the vocabulary of diplomacy is pleasant and comforting, especially to war-weary Americans. Obama's deals with Iran and Cuba are good examples of how diplomacy can triumph, as long as you are willing to concede everything to a brutal dictatorship. Every time the White House makes a new concession to Iran, I check the State Department's own website list of state sponsors of terror. And sure enough, Iran is still there. This is not diplomacy, this is capitulation. Every time John Kerry meets with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, I'm afraid that if they spend too much time together, Kerry will give Alaska back to Russia. Nations that value democracy and individual liberty now control the greater part of the world's resources, as well as its military power. If we band together and refuse to coddle the rogue regimes and sponsors of terror, our authority will be irresistible. Our combined wealth can also fund new technologies to cure our fossil fuel addiction, which currently empowers a majority of the terrorists and dictators. The so-called leaders of the free world talk about promoting democracy while treating the leaders of the world's most oppressive regimes as equals. You cannot stand for democracy while standing next to Vladimir Putin. And do not tell me it's too risky to confront Putin or that he's too strong. More formidable than Stalin when Truman stood up to him. More dangerous than the USSR when JFK faced the Cuban Missile Crisis. More powerful than the evil empire confronted by Ronald Reagan. No, no, and no. Our enemies have not grown stronger. It is our resolve has grown weaker. During the 7 years of the Obama administration, we have seen that inaction can also have the gravest consequences. Inaction can fracture alliances. Inaction can empower dictators, embolden terrorists, and inflame regional conflicts. Inaction can slaughter innocent people and create millions of refugees. We have the horrific proof in Syria, where Obama's infamous red line has been painted over in blood. Harry Truman warned us in 1951, defending US intervention in Korea in a speech at the Chapel of the Four Chaplains in Philadelphia. He said that American soldiers were fighting to prevent the slaughter of a bigger conflict, and that restraining aggression was the only way to avoid another world war. Truman said, "We cannot measure sacrifice with a teaspoon while the fight is on." And continued, and I quote, "We cannot lead the forces of freedom from behind." Said in 1951. Today, Obama and his fellow neo-isolationists on both sides of the political aisle ignore that truth. They are well aware that the few are condemned and few are convicted for having the power to prevent a tragedy, but refusing to do so, while a single death resulting from intervention will be denounced. 250,000 deaths, a dozen terror attacks, 1 million refugees. These are politically acceptable consequences of inaction. But a single casualty from action, from attempting to prevent those horrors, is considered politically unacceptable. This is the ghastly arithmetic of appeasement in the 21st century. We must not let the fear of making things worse paralyze us against trying to make things better. I reject the tired premise of whether or not the United States should be the global policeman. Global leadership is what is required, not a cop on patrol who occasionally shoots or carpet bombs a few bad guys. Americans have become accustomed to demanding the impossible, and their politicians have become accustomed to providing it. Massive debt fuels education and the stock market. Calls for greater security are accompanied by a refusal to invest or sacrifice to achieve it. The bipartisan acceptance of reality has gone missing in America's hyper-partisan political environment. The idea that America can be a global force of stability and freedom has been abandoned by Washington, reflecting an American Main Street that is more interested in fleeting stock market values than in the lasting values of global democracy. We must look to the next generation, not to the next poll or the next election. Yes, I advocate for a return to many of the principles and policies that were dominant in the West during the Cold War. But that does not mean I want to turn back the clock. As the Holy Bible says, No one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. We cannot pour the modern wine of globalization and the multipolar world into the old wineskin of obsolete Cold War rules and regulations. Times change. Circumstances change. Our institutions must change, but our values must not. We're here today in a building that was built on stones that were brought from London after the original church was destroyed by Nazi bombs. A fitting memorial, without a doubt. The values that won the Cold War are the stones upon which we must build our new world. The values of Winston Churchill are the stones upon which we must build his vision of global democracy, global prosperity, and global peace. We have the tools, and we have the strengths. All we need is the courage to continue. Thank you.
Mr. Kasparov asked if you have any questions. We can do a few questions.
I presume that chess players peak at some age. Do you think world leaders should be picked according to when they are peaking and when you think they can be?
I'm afraid there is no rule. So we saw, great leaders at very young age, or pretty, bad, ineffective leaders, who were much older. So it all depends on the quality of a man or a woman.
Were you supporting the presidential race in the United States?
It is leading to a moment where I could be very happy that I'm not an American citizen and I should not make a choice. I didn't think for a moment that we would be in the situation where, Americans will have to choose for the lesser evil. It's a level of unacceptability. So for instance, the only good thing I can say about Donald Trump, that he serves as the litmus test for political decency.
What do you think Mr. Putin is going to do with Mr. Snowden?
I don't think Mr. Putin cares about Mr. Snowden. He cares about the information that Mr. Snowden keeps providing to him. And that's why I had my doubts from day one when I saw Mr. Snowden ending up in Moscow, that his escape from the United States was spontaneous.
Americans have an embarrassing disinterest in history. Given that, how do you think the best method is to present a warning about Putin and what he is and where he's coming from?
Education is universal. You just have to, to bring their attention to the fact that American interest, is in danger as well, because the world is getting smaller and smaller. Europeans, thought that Syria was far away, and technically, you look at the map, it's a few thousand miles away. But the moment you have millions of refugees, fleeing over, it's a different ballgame. And Putin realized that he could weaponize the refugees. Because what happens there, he keeps bombing Syrians. They are him or Bashar al-Assad or his buddies from Iran. They're pushing them out of the country. They're moving into Europe. They create political crisis. The crisis is threatening mainstream political parties, and the crisis benefits ultra-nationalist groups. All of them accidentally support Mr. Putin. So, and he hopes that with their political support, he can lift the sanctions. So there's nothing that happens today in the world, whether it's in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America or in Europe, it's too far away not to have some effect on you. Because the United States is the most globalized economy. And how can you pretend that, being the most globalized economy, having enormous benefits from global trade, global finance, global labor, that you can, stay away from global affairs? Okay.
What is the Russian millennials' opinion on Putin and the support?
Look, unfortunately, unlike in this country or in Europe, we cannot measure this support or their level of dissatisfaction because the polling system is rigged. I'm sure that after annexation of Crimea, many of young Russians, they felt enthusiastic. Same way as many young Germans were enthusiastic in 1938 or 1939, not recognizing what will happen next. Just to tell you about the level of Mr. Putin's confidence is just you look at his recent moves. A few days ago, he signed a decree creating a National Guard. It's not National Guard on American standards. It's more like a private army of bodyguards that brings together the most capable military and security units in Russia. 400,000 under the command of the former head of Kremlin security. And they are given the rights to shoot people in the streets without warning if they believe there is a threat for public order. Now, if we're to believe for 86% support for Mr. Putin, why do you need 400,000 best equipped soldiers and policemen as your own protection? So, these numbers just simply, just do not work together. Go ahead, Rex.
All right, so with the recent Turkey shooting down a Russian jet over Syria, I believe, what do you think that Turkey, as a member of NATO, and NATO's response and the balance of power shifting in this whole region, more globalized conflict, what do you think Russia and NATO should be doing?
No, look, I can tell you exactly what Putin will do because he reached a point, of his rule where, there's no way back. He has burned all the bridges. All he can do is just, to stock cows and to create new conflicts. Because this is, it's the main weapon of Russian domestic propaganda. Everything he does outside of Russia is aimed at Russians inside the country because he has to sell his leadership, his dictatorship. Why he's there for 16 years and why he's planning to stay for the rest of his life. Economy is in a free fall. Is no longer, a deal between Putin and the Russian population that, look, you give up your freedom, but, I guarantee you steady improvement of living standards. So people are suffering, and the only way to explain why Putin is no longer capable of providing the same comfort for them is to present enemies. Country surrounded by enemies. It's the besieged country that only Vladimir Putin, the white knight, could defend against world's evil. So that's why Putin will keep creating enemies. He's quite good at that. Yeah, and he will always create. He will, it was always like testing the water. Dictators, they have excellent animal instinct. They test, and then if they smell weakness and blood, they go for a kill. If they feel steel, they retreat. Again, you can look back, it's Truman, Stalin, and many other cases in the history of the 20th century. Putin tried many times, just to test the resolve from NATO countries. The Russian military planes violated the airspace of numerous NATO countries, including this one. Now, the question is, how many times Russian planes have violated airspace of Turkey after the plane was shot? 0, none. Because Russian pilots, I'm sure they're patriots, but they're not kamikaze. So this story, this very sad story, because, I'm sorry for this Russian pilot who was killed there, but it just tells you that unless you hold your ground, you will never stop the dictator. Dictators do not ask why; they always ask why not, and they are not stopped until they're stopped. So as much as I am confident about what Putin is going to do, I'm in darkness about NATO intentions. Because at the end of the day, NATO is a military alliance led by the United States. And if you have the commander-in-chief of the United States Army, pretending that, we have to find peaceful solution for every military crisis, I mean, as I said in my speech, it emboldens terrorists and dictators. So that's why for the next 270 or so days, I don't expect much from the United States. The problem is I'm no longer confident about what will happen from January 20th, 2017. Rex.
In that vein, given that Obama only has 10 months left to damage the United States and the free world, are you surprised that Putin has not moved into the Baltic states?
Look, I'm not a Nostradamus of geopolitics. I don't have a crystal ball. But let me tell you that if you look at the Putin's record and at the pattern, most likely, if he wants to attack Baltic states or to have any other conflict, a new conflict, that should be late July, August, early September. Because that will be the sort of, as in 2008, when he attacked the Republic of Georgia. It's a moment when you have an outgoing administration. You already have both conventions nominating the respective leaders, but it's still not clear who is going to win. So there will be 2 or 3 months before, again, allegedly the leader emerges in October, that America will be totally paralyzed. So that's why I still believe it's the worst is yet to come. Putin is now desperately trying to leave the sanctions. The Russian lobbying groups are very active in Europe. Just a few days ago, they succeeded in supporting the ultranationalist groups in Holland, winning the referendum against the association with Ukraine. And now there's the huge Russian effort behind Brexit. This is the biggest dream for Putin. So for European Union to collapse. And naturally the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the Union might have terrible consequences. So far, Putin is still playing, more traditional games for him, because let's not forget, he's a KGB guy. He's not a military dictator. He's more comfortable by creating all sorts of these clandestine operations rather than, hitting the target directly. But if he fails, if sanctions stays, if Chancellor Angela Merkel survives, if Brexit fails and UK also stays in the Union, I think by August, I think he'll be ready for another go. So how many? Okay, go. Look, yes, I do have fears for my own safety. That's why I left Moscow. Yes, and I live in New York. So it's Upper West Side is definitely a much safer place. Yes. People keep asking me if I can go back to Moscow. I say, yes, technically I can. It's not a problem, but it could be a one-way ticket. But to be more, serious, yeah, it's a very painful question, just for me and for my family, but what can I do? I mean, my dear friend Boris Nemtsov, he stayed there. He actually told me, get out of the country, when in February 2013 I was summoned by Russian analog of FBI, to tell them about opposition activities, basically about our peaceful demonstrations. And Boris said, look, enter the building as a witness, and if you leave the building, most likely you'll be the suspect. So, and I stayed away, and unfortunately, he didn't follow his own advice. So, I think that it's getting more complicated for Putin just to go after all opposition activists, because so many of us are abroad now. And again, going back to the funny version of the response is that I spend so much time hitting the road, just traveling around the world. My schedule is so hectic, it's very hard to follow. Yeah. Okay, back, yes. Look, I mean, that's conflict affected me and my family and my friends, because we were Armenians, were born and raised in Baku, and we had to escape in January 1990 at the time of the ethnic cleansing, when just almost none of the 250,000 Armenians who lived in Baku, they had to escape. I don't think that we have any solution in a foreseeable future, because unfortunately on both sides, whether it's Azeri side or Armenian side, there is the great interest of preserving the conflict, because you have regimes in both countries that build their legitimacy over this war. And you have the family dictatorship of Aliyevs in Azerbaijan, and you have the more or less a military dictatorship in Armenia that made Nagorno-Karabakh sort of the key element of its political survival. Unfortunately, I have to say that Armenia is nothing else but a Russian proxy in the Caucasus, because the country is owned by Russian oligarchs, and Putin definitely has an interest of creating another conflict, and he doesn't have to invent it; it's there. So that's why there are too many powerful interests. And now you add Erdogan, Turkish president, who also has an interest in hurting Putin, or just creating something just in the south of the southern border of Russia. So I'm extremely pessimistic about the future perspectives, as long as the world remains such a dangerous and unstable place. That's the last question. Okay, you are.
The oil and export law was vetoed, and the Canadian pipeline, do you think those are good things that the president trying to reinstate to help fight the idea that oil is a dictator's export type of thing?
Are we talking about Keystone Pipeline?
Yeah, Keystone Pipeline.
Was it a good idea or bad idea?
I think it was a good idea.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I just no, it's as I mentioned. It's just when you look at the world today, you find out that most of the terrorist groups or dictatorships, they are funded by oil. There are a few exceptions like Norway, but in general, oil money always, are in most of the cases used to fuel terrorist activities. Fracking industry in this country actually, served well against dictators because it brought prices down. Ideally, I hope that this country will lead a new cycle of technological revolution to make sure that the fossil fuel is redundant. Because just imagine that if oil disappears, we don't have to talk about Vladimir Putin anymore, or about Iranian mullahs, or about Venezuelan Chavistas. So many of these problems will be solved, but again, we have to remember, that it's just as before, we deliver the final blow, the tactical win. We have to come up with a strategy. As, for instance, Ronald Reagan came up with a strategy in the 80s to deal with the Saudis, to bring oil prices down, and to hurt the Soviet Union. So I just hope that eventually, the leadership in this country, I don't know when, will come up with a plan, just to move us into the future. And then not tomorrow or next year. The strength of democracy is its inability to think long term. It's like, it's in chess. You can have tactical solution or strategic solution. Dictators, by definition, play tactical games because they care about survival. It's all about what happens today or tomorrow morning. Democracies could rely on lasting institutions because these institutions will succeed even when the politician who set them up, as for instance Harry Truman, is no longer around. And this is what is required. And that's, we need politicians, we need statesmen who will think, long term, and will be working for institutions, for their country, not for just, short-term gains and flashy press conferences. So there are many more hands. Okay, let's go. Yes,
Being a strategist yourself, what do you anticipate as Putin's next target to expand borders like he did with Crimea, Ukraine? What do you anticipate as his next strategic area?
Unfortunately, he has quite a few choices. Because, he's looking for the world map and he finds too many weak spots. Because America's retreat has created a lot of vacuum. And the vacuum always filled by someone. And bad guys are much more capable of filling the vacuum because they don't have to play by the rules. Putin doesn't have to go to the Congress, he doesn't care about the press, he decides and he moves the army, as every dictator. I think that his goal is not so much to actually take over more territory, but rather to show that European Union, NATO, the United States, they're weak. So his goal is to destroy the system of global security, and to demonstrate, for instance, that NATO is nothing else but a paper tiger. So that's why some kind of a hybrid war in the Baltics, not with an intention of occupying this, but to demonstrate that NATO will not protect one of its members. That's the most desirable target for Putin. But that's a big game.
Some people speculate that he's trying to rebuild the USSR as it was before.
No, I don't think that, I think we give him too much credit, for being an imperialist. I mean, he's a dictator who cares about survival. And he knows that there's no physical life for him outside of Kremlin. If he loses political power, he's done. So that's why, he should look for an opportunity, just to project his image as a strong leader. Because that's what he can sell to the Russian public. As in every mafia structure, as long as the mafia boss looks strong, nobody will challenge him. It's not necessarily the real, strength or weakness. It's about perception. And Putin he's a brilliant tactician. I can just, remind you obviously remember his trip to New York at the United Nations General Assembly, where he met Obama, President Obama. And, when the news, broke about Putin's, trip to New York, Wall Street Journal asked me to write an editorial. And I said I could do it in advance. They were quite, shocked. How come? I said, look, I believed it was not about him just showing up and delivering a speech, but it was about, projecting the strengths. Now, they asked me to write it later. I did it, of course. But the whole purpose of this trip was not about appearance in the United Nations. It was not about delivering a speech. I don't think he cared what he said there. It was all about seeing Obama, and you remember this reluctant handshake that Obama extended his hand and Putin reluctantly shook his hand. This is the picture. Because they say the picture worth 1,000 words. Putin actually had both the picture and the 1,000 words. It was all over the Russian press. And it's the story behind it is very simple, the narrative. Putin had to go to New York, United Nations, had to go to the belly of the beast, had to meet Obama. He had to reluctantly shake his hand. And the next day, the very next day, Russian planes bombed American-backed rebels in Syria. Now, what do you think if you are an average Russian? Putin, just is a big will. He can defy America, he can defy Obama, and he can just move anywhere he wants. So he will keep doing the same things because it's all about an image. And territory is it's too much headache. Okay, last question. I've seen a female, but very, very last question this time. No, it's any conflict actually is good for Putin's regime. So the worst news for Putin is stability, prosperity, because the regimes like Putin, they cannot compete on ideas, innovations, technology, but they have a very serious competitive advantage over us. It's a value of human life. We believe each human life is unique. For Putin, it's statistics. Killing 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people, it's just a demonstration of strength. He has no allergy for blood. So that's why, I can tell you, as long as he can find conflicts and sort of to inflame the regional conflicts, it will be very difficult to remove him from Kremlin. Thank you.
We have a gift for Mr. Kasparov. I'd like to ask alumnus and member of the Board of Trustees at Westminster College, Brock Ayers, to help me present it to him.
On behalf of the National Churchill Museum and the Westminster College community, Mr. Kasparov, thank you so much for spending a day of freedom on a beautiful Missouri day here with us today. This is a place in the museum and the college that many of us hold dear, and we have a little memento that we think can help reflect, as you mentioned, on the leadership, the life, the legacy, the lessons of Sir Winston Churchill. What we would like to present to you, if you would come up, is an actual ticket to the 1946 Iron Curtain speech, your own very authentic ticket there, and we hope that as you travel and speak,
Your own time machine.
your own time machine, but we hope that you hold that dear and that you will tell everybody about this wonderful place, this wonderful museum, the important mission here, and this wonderful college. Thank you very much for joining us.
And you all are invited to join us downstairs in the museum